Today's daf we're going to be learning is Pesachim daf Kuf Daled. Today's daf is dedicated by Ora F. Zipper in memory of her late husband, Stuart Simcha Cohen ben Avraham, and by Ellen Golub and Steve Sass in memory of Ellen's father, Leo Golub. Aryeh Leib ben Eliyahu Vimasi on his 7th yahrzeit. He was a native Yiddish speaker who loved the Jewish people, and despite a streak of atheism, insisted that his only daughter have an excellent Jewish education. He devoted his life to building a curious, creative, and loving Jewish family and is remembered joyfully by 7 grandchildren and 8 great-grandchildren. Yehi zichrono livracha. Okay, with that, we're going to get started. We ended yesterday. We'll just do a quick review. We were at the story of Rav Yaakov bar Abba, who comes to Rava's house. You remember, and that one fateful Shabbat, he starts questioning him, why do you do this? And why do you do that? And why do you do this? And we get to the end of Shabbat, right? Rava's probably had enough of him. And he starts off with questions on Havdalah. Why the candle, right? The torch type candle. And why, now we're up to, why do you say this whole long Hamavdil bein Kodesh l'chol, bein Or l'choshech, bein Yisrael la'amim, bein Yom HaShvi'i l'sheshei ma'aseh, which to us sounds very familiar, but to him, that wasn't what he was used to. And today we're going to see a lot about the development of the blessings of Havdalah, okay, or specifically the Havdalah blessing, which is, right, again, Havdalah is made up of, as we saw, Yachnaha and all that, it's made up of the wine and the Besamim and the Ner, but also, right, the main part is the Havdalah blessing, and that's the part we're going to focus on today. So he says, right, why do you do this, right? Didn't Rabbi Yehuda say in the name of Shmuel, Hamavdil ben Kodesh l'chol, that's Havdalah of Rabbi Yehuda Nasi, so why are you adding all this other stuff? Amar Leis, he says to him, just the 3 lines from the bottom of Kuftal Amud Bet, Anakas Svirale, I hold by what Rabbi Elazar says in the name of Rabbi Yoshaya, which is Hapochet lo yifchot migimo, v'lo yosif lo yosif al sheva. And anyone who can do the minimum, you have to do 3. Anyone who's going to do the maximum, you have to do 7. Now, one can read this as you have a range from 3 to 7, but it doesn't seem to mean this, or at least he doesn't read it this way. And Rav Yaakov bar Abba continues to bother him. But you didn't say 3 and you didn't say 7. In other words, if you want to do the minimum, so do 3. If you want to do the maximum, do 7. You did 4, right? We counted 4 there. And right? So why did you do 7? He says, really, now we're going to learn about laws of blessings in general. That generally we say in the middle or toward the end of the blessing, often we say, in this case, it's right at the end, is what we call the ending, the conclusion of the bracha before we say the Baruch Atah Hashem. We want to say something that's like that blessing. Okay, so we do this in Shemona Esrei all the time, right? Because you're the God who hears our prayers, Baruch Atah Hashem, Shomea Tefillah, right? We say, we're going to say in a second, God hears our prayers. So before that, we say, well, you are the God who hears our prayers. So that's what he says. That's why Yom HaShvi'i l'sheshei ma'aseh is basically saying, I split between Kodesh and Chol, 6 days of the week, and the 7th day. So that's not in the count. And therefore, it's really only 3. And similarly, Rabbi Yehuda said in the name of Shmuel, he says you have to say something like the conclusion of the bracha before you finish the bracha. Again, the chatima means the Baruch Atah Hashem, whatever comes after Baruch Atah Hashem, that's the part that's the chatima, and that has to be said also before. Upumpadite amre, but in Pumpadita, the people from Pumpadita say me'en ptichatan samuch lechatimatan. That when you do that part before the end, it's not supposed to be like the end, like the Baruch Atah Hashem part. It's supposed to be similar to the first line of the blessing, okay, where you started from. So, my benayu, when would you have a difference between them? Because in the Havdalah blessing, it's all the same idea. And whether it's like the beginning or it's like the end, it really would come out the same. But they're now going to show that there's a case where there would be a difference. When you have Yom Tov, this is a case we've been discussing. Yom Tov comes right after Shabbat. You say Havdalah in Kiddush, remember? Now, the Havdalah version there starts off with Hamavdil ben Kodesh l'chol, that in general, God separates between the sacred and the profane. But then when it ends, it has the blessing Hamavdil ben Kodesh l'kodesh. So now If you're going to say it's like the beginning, then you'll say Amavdil ben Kodesh L'chol before you get to the blessing. If you say just before the blessing, you're supposed to say something similar to the blessing, to the end of the blessing, then you would say Amavdil ben Kodesh L'Kodesh. So let's see. And in fact, this is what we do. You'll see which way we hold. So now we're going to read it. Ben Kodesh L'Kodesh. That's the blessing, because you're really distinguishing between two different sanctities. Right now, why are we making Havdalah if both are sanctified? So that's because, and we'll see this in a few minutes, the sanctity of Yom Tov is lower than the sanctity of Shabbat. And that's why we only do it when Yom Tov falls on Motzei Shabbat, but not when it's the reverse. When Shabbat goes into Yom Tov, like for example, I just said it wrong. When Shabbat goes into Yom Tov, that's when you do it. But when Yom Tov goes into Shabbat, you don't do it because you're going to a higher level of sanctity. Why is it higher? Because on Yom Tov you can cook, right? You can do things for Ochel Nefesh, so therefore it's less sanctity. So now we say, so since we finished the bracha with Ben Kodesh L'Kodesh, but we don't start the bracha by saying that. So Manda Amar Me'im Ptichatan Samuch L'Chatimatan Lo Bai L'Meimar Ben Kedushat Shabbat L'Kedushat Yom Tov Ivdalta. You don't need to say, if you're going to say it like the beginning, so then you don't say God separated between Kedushat Shabbat and Kedushat Yom Tov. But Umanda Amal, and the one who says though Me'in Chatimatan Samuch L'Chatimatan, if you say you're supposed to say like the blessing just before, Bai L'Meimar Ben Kedushat Shabbat L'Kedushat Yom Tov Ivdalta, which is what we actually say. Right? That's something that should sound familiar to you. That's the version that we say. Okay, Gufa. Now we're going to go back into this issue about the 3 versus 7. How many languages of Havdalah separations are you supposed to say? And I've talked about this before, about the development of prayer. I talked about this yesterday, that you're going to get rules. And this is what there are. There's a lot of rules, like this bracha thing. You're supposed to say something like the end of the bracha before, because the brachot weren't set. You don't need all these rules for us nowadays, because all we do is we open a siddur or a bencher, and we open it and we read exactly what it says. But in those days, they used to they'd have the rules, and then they'd make up their own words. So if you know you're going to end the blessing this way, so right before the blessing, you should say something like that. Okay, and all the rules we're going to see, or you need 3 versus 7, they basically need to tell you what are the criteria, what type of 3, here are the numbers, either do 3 or do 7. What are you supposed to, what kind of Havdalah? Can you make up anything you want? Like, what's the framework? So that's what they're giving you. They're giving you a framework, but they're not giving you a text, like a siddur, because in those days, it didn't work that way. Like, this is something that developed over time. And since what we're discussing is really the time period following the destruction of the temple, when prayers started to become much more developed because they no longer had sacrifices. And there was some prayer before that, and it really developed mostly after the destruction of the first temple. From there were certain prayers that were instituted during the temple time period. Okay, we'll see it. We have a long, long time. But when we get to Masechet Tamid, for example, you start to see the prayers that they said in the temple and the prayers of the people. There were a group of people that would come to the temple to pray, of the Israelim, right? Because the Kohanim and the Leviim worked there, and the Kohanim had certain prayers they had to say, and the Ma'amadot, they were called. These were the people who would come to pray that the Korban would be accepted, that the sacrifices would be accepted. And they had a certain prayer, like, for example, the Tefillah of Ritzeh. Ritzeh is, in our Shemona Esrei, we pray that our sacrifices will be accepted. Now, it's a little bit changed because it's now, bring us back to the temple. Obviously, they didn't say that, but the content of the bracha is really about having our sacrifices be accepted. So they talk about the avodah. So anyway, there was some prayer, but it was much more fluid, and it wasn't as set as it was today. And again, it slowly developed over the second temple time period, but much more so developed after the destruction of the temple in the generations that came after that, till it became something much more set. The Rambam has a great introduction in the beginning of Hilchot Tefillah in the Mishnah Torah, where he talks about how because of the Galut and because of the exile, and because we no longer know how to express ourselves, we had to make things much more set. But originally, they really weren't. So anyway, let's keep reading. So Amar Rabbi Elazar, Amar Rabbi Yoshai, we're now going to go in depth into this statement. Meitive, we're going to bring a contradictory source from the Tannaitic time period. Remember, these are Amoraim. They can't contradict a Braita. It says, Omer Havdalot b'motzei Shabbatot. Okay, the first issue doesn't relate directly. I mean, it relates to Havdalah, but not to the 3 or 7. You say Havdalah when, okay, we're now going to have a list. What prayers do you make Havdalah? And this relates to something I was talking about earlier. From Motzei Shabbat, okay, any Motzei Shabbat, or Motzei Yamim Tovim, when Yom Tov ends, or Motzei Yom Kippurim, when Yom Kippur ends, Ubi Motzei Shabbat li Yom Tov, or when Shabbat goes into a Yom Tov, exactly for what we said. Ubi Motzei Yom Tov l'Cholosh Moed, and from Yantif to Chol Moed, because Chol Moed you can do work, right? Anytime you're going down in sanctity. Aval lo b'motzei Yom Tov l'Shabbat, but not in the other direction. If Yom Tov goes into Shabbat, you don't say Havdalah. Haragil omer habe. Now here you really have it. Haragil says a lot. What does it mean, Haragil? This is someone who's got the words. They're at his fingertips, right? He knows how to say things. So if you're used to it, and you can say a lot of Havdalot, go for it. Sheino Hagil, but if you don't really know, then say how many? Now, not 3, like you said, but Omer Echat. You only say 1. If you don't know so much, just say Hamavdil ben Kodesh l'chol or something like that, right? Or some sort of Havdalah, 1, that's enough, and then do your Havdalah. So how could Rabbi Yoshaya have said 3 or 7 when here it says in the Braita explicitly 1 is enough? Tanaihi, it's a machloket between Tanaim. The Amar Rabbi Yochanan, as Rabbi Yochanan says, now you would expect to see a Braita, but we don't see a Braita. So what do we have? We have Rabbi Yochanan, who's an Amora, but he says, Binan shel Kedoshim Omer Echat. Binan Gua'am Lomar Shalosh. The son of holy people, we'll see who this is, who he's referring to in a minute. He says 1, but the people say 3. So from here they assume, must be a Tanaitic opinion, that there's 1, but he points out that most people say 3. Okay, that's the general. So now they say man nihu benan shel kedoshim. Right. By the way, 3 is what we do, right? Because we say Amavdil ben Kodesh l'chol ben or l'choshech ben Yisrael la'amim ben Yom Hashvi'i l'sheshem ha'maseh. Okay, but the sheshem ha'maseh is just the chatima, so we really say 3, just like we saw before. So the nahagu am, it's interesting, right? What was customary then is still customary now. So now they say man nihu benan shel kedoshim. So who is this person, by the way? Rabbi Menachem bar Simai. Okay, that's who it is. Amre karilu benan shel kedoshim. No, Amai karile benan shel kedoshim. For what reason did he get this title? The son of sanctified people. De lo istakil b'tzurata dezuza. Okay, he didn't look at the faces. There's always these images in the coins. He wouldn't look at them because concerned that it might be avodah zarah, worshiping idols. So he wouldn't even look at them. Now it's interesting. They call him. He should be sanctified one and not the son of sanctified ones. But this is right. If the apple doesn't fall far from the tree, and if he was so sanctified, his father must have been also. So they call him by the name of his father. Okay, there's a bunch of different things written about this, but we're going to move on. Shalach le Rav Shmuel bar Idi. So now Rav Shmuel bar Idi sends to. It's not clear actually who he sends to. I didn't see. Shalach lehu. Maybe he's sent to them. Maybe to his people. Hananya achi omer echat v'leitil chata kavate. Hananya, my brother, said only 1, but the halacha is not like my brother. Amar Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi. Another opinion. This is an Amora from Israel again. Hamavdil tzarich shiomar me'en havdalot amurot b'Torah. So I told you we're going to get different rules. So we had 1, 3, or 7. That's how many havdalot you're supposed to do, with a preference for more, right? Whether it be at least 3 or 7, if even better. Now we're going to talk about where do you get this language of Havdalah from? So he says, Hamavdil says, Me'en Havdalot that are said in the Torah. In other words, you have to find verses where the word, the shoresh, the root, lahavdil, to separate, comes up in the Torah. So now we're going to see that there's a bit of a problem with what he says from a Braita. Meitive, and we'll see in a minute where all these things come from the Torah. So Meitive, Seder Havdalot Te'ach. What's the order? How do you do Havdalah? Omer, and it's not, again, we're not talking here about the other blessings and all the discussion about Ner, B'samim, which comes first, which comes second. That's not the discussion. This is that was yesterday. Today we're talking about how do you say the bracha of the Havdalah bracha, the one that we're discussing. Omer, Hamavdil ben Kodesh l'chol. Okay, so now I'm going to read you, each time we get to one, I'm going to read you the verse that corresponds with it. The Shanstein lists all the psukim if you have them. You have the Shanstein. Ben Kodesh l'chol comes from the pasuk Vayikra Yud pasuk Perik Yud chapter 10 pasuk 10. Ulahavdil ben hakodesh u ben hachol. Okay, there you have it. Next one. Ben or l'choshech. That's easy. That's in Sefer Breshit. Vayavdel Elohim ben ha'or ben ha'choshech, right? The very beginning, the fourth verse in the Torah, God separated between light and dark. Ben Yisrael Amim, in Vayikra, chapter 20, pasuk 26, Vavdil etchem min ha'amim lihiyot li, I will separate you from the nations to be for me. Okay, so we've got ben kodesh l'chol, ben or l'choshech, ben Yisrael Amim. Now we're up to ben yom hashvi'i l'sheshei mea ma'aseh. There's no verse that talks about Havdalah there. Okay, but that's not going to bother us. Why is it not going to bother us? Because that's not one of the list. That's the one that's just to be like the conclusion. Ben tameh letahor. I'm just going to raise the question, by the way. I don't have an answer for this. Usually you do it toward the end, like in Shemona Esrei. This is weird because it comes in the middle. Okay, now it does come at the end of the first three, and maybe it's like this is a section, and then we're adding a few more. Ben tameh letahor. Okay, this comes up in Kashrus. It says Ulavdil ben atameu ben atahor. Vayikra Yud pasuk Yud. Right, it says there Ulavdil ben akodesh ben achol ben atameu ben atahor. So there you have 2 and 1. Right, it's got both those in that one pasuk. Ben ayam lacharava. Okay, between the water and the dry area like land. Doesn't say it in a pasuk anywhere. We're going to get to that, and that's why we're bringing this as a contradiction to Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi, because he says it has to be from Psukim in the Torah, and there is no verse here. Ben mayim ha'elyonim l'mayim atachtonim. So between the waters above and the waters below, where is that? Also from creation, from the 7th verse in the Torah. Vayavdel ben hamayim asher mitachat larakia. God separated between the mayim that's under the firmament, the water that's under the firmament, uben hamayim asher me'al larakia, and the one that was above the firmament. Ben Kohanim Leviim v'Yisraelim, okay, between Kohanim, Leviim, and Yisraelim, between the different types of, like the way we separate within the Jewish community, right? Well, anyway, that's all separate issue, complicated, but anyway, we'll talk about that in a minute. Where that comes in a verse, we'll see in the Gemara. So the others weren't in the Gemara, so I read you them already. I see, Caroline, you pointed out that before what I was struggling with about Rav Shmuel Bar Idi, Shalach Lei, who he was sending to. So according to the Steinsaltz, it says he was sending to Rabbi Menachem Bar Simai from our previous. So it's possible that's what we're talking about. Okay, so now we're still in the Breita though. We brought this as a question. We already know why it's a question because at least one of them is not mentioned in the Torah. V'chotem, but here we get another machloket, which is what's the final blessing at the end of this blessing? What do we say when we say Baruch Atah Hashem? How do we end it? Now, until now, we assumed we were ending it the way we know, which is Hamavdil ben Kodesh Chol, and that was the whole discussion. Sheshimea Maaseh, right? We separate between Shabbat and the other days. That's the same as saying Hamavdil ben Kodesh Chol, or theoretically. I mean, it doesn't exactly say the same thing explicitly, but it's the same kind of idea. But here we're going to see 3 different versions. None of them are that. Okay, so Chotem besoder bereshit. This is interesting. God organizes what he created. Right? Think about it. First, you just create. When you're done with creation, what do? You then organize everything. So after the first week, God rested on Shabbat. And then what was the first thing God had to do when Motzei Shabbat came in? Organize everything. So that's what we make the blessing on Saturday night. It's all about creating. Now, why creating? Well, it's not that we're talking about the first Motzei Shabbat that was. We're talking about the first Motzei Shabbat is really remembering Yom Rishon, the first day of creation. And there's a Rashi on Breshit Perek Bet, I think it's Pasuk Dalid or Pasuk Hey, one of those, I forget which Pasuk it's Breshit Dalid, Perek Bet Pasuk Dalid, where it talks about, and this is the Bihi Bara'am, like as the world was created, it's in the second description of the creation. And there's an intro pasuk there, and Rashi says there, from here we learn that God had really created everything on the first day, and then just kind of separated it by days. But everything theoretically was already created on day number 1. So from there they say, oh, Yotzer Breshit, God created everything really on Sunday. Okay, and that's why, yes, it's true. We say, we created different things, different days, but this is a certain approach that really theoretically everything was created, and then kind of it was separated into days, but there was all already somewhat there. So that's why we're saying Yotzer Breshit to commemorate, and this is different. Like I said, it's not the first Motzei Shabbat, it's commemorating the first Shabbat, the first Sunday that existed and what God created on that day. It's like going back a week. Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Yehuda Omer, Chotem Mekadesh Yisrael. This is more similar to the first one, but it's a little bit different. The first two are universal. All have to do with creation, which obviously affects everyone in the world. The third one, and you see this all the time in prayer, where do we go? Are we talking about the Jewish people? Or are we talking about universal themes? This comes up very much so in Malchuyot when it comes to Rosh Hashanah? Is it a bracha about God's kingship over the world or God's kingship over us? Right? The opinion that won out was God's kingship over the world, and that's why it's a very universal blessing. But it wasn't always the case. There was a debate about it. And this comes up in many places. And this is saying, yes, it's true, God created the world. And what did God do on Motzei Shabbat? Well, he decided, oh, you're the chosen people, and I'm sanctifying you as opposed to all the other people on earth. And therefore, we say Mekadesh Israel and how it relates to us. That, you know, you can take that idea in many places, what it means, but that's what the idea that we say on Motzei Shabbat. So notice our blessing isn't even in this Braita, but that's not why we brought this Braita. We'll get back to the blessings in a few minutes. So now they say, if Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi, you're right, that all of them have to come from verses, there's a bit of a problem. So he says, right between the Yam and the Charava, okay, and so thank you, Gita, for pointing that out. I didn't really say this, which is the idea of Mekadesh Yisrael. I'm just going back for a minute. Mekadesh Yisrael is about the reason why we have Shabbat, right? Shabbat is unique to the Jewish people. It's because we were the ones sanctified. Okay, so now he says, if that's the case, im ita, so then why does it say ben hayam l'charava? There's no verse that talks about that. So the simple answer, mikam ben hayam l'charava. Take it off the list, okay? Which sounds very nice, but what's the problem if we take it off the list? We started with 7, and now we're only going to have 6. Remember, we said it's either 3 or 7. So if you want to say that doesn't belong on the list, right? Ihachi. So then they say, before we even get to the problem of the numbers, they're going to say, we have another problem. Ihachi ben yom hashvi l'sheshe me'amase nami me'en chatimahu. Nami, question. What about ben yom hashvi l'sheshe me'amase? There's no verse that talks about havdalah and, you know, that root within the verse about that. That we already explained. Me'en chatimahu. That's not one of the count. That's not one of the ones. It doesn't need a special verse. So they say, but now we're left with only 6. Now let's look through and let's see. So we have, you should never take their word for it when they say numbers. You should always check yourself because it's not always accurate. So, ben kodesh l'chol, it's not exactly accurate. It's just sometimes they count a little bit differently than we might. So, ben kodesh l'chol, ben or l'choshech, ben Yisrael la'amim, that gets us up to 3. Ben yom hashvi l'sheshe me'amase, we already put on the side and said it's not part of the count. Ben tameh l'tahol, ben hayam l'charava, we've gotten rid of. Ben mayim ha'elyonim l'mayim ha'tachtonim is 5. Ben kohanim l'leviyim v'yisraelim is 6. So we're left only with 6. So now they say, okay, so now what? Amre kohanim v'leviyim v'yisraelim t'chei mileninu. That's 2 separate ones. In other words, ben kohanim l'leviyim is 1. Ben leviyim l'yisraelim is 2. And now we're going to have to find verses for these because where's the verse? So ben leviyim l'yisraelim dichtiv ba'et hayivdil Hashem et shevet Levi. At that moment, God took shevet Levi and separated them from the Yisraelim. So that's the pasuk between the Levites and the rest of the people. Ben kohanim leviim, where do we see that God separated the priests from the Leviim, from the Levites, because they're part of that tribe? Dichtiv b'nei Amram Aharon uMoshe, vayibadel Aharon lakdisho kodesh kodeshim. And Aharon was separated. This is a pasuk, by the way, in Divrei Yamim, in Chronicles, not exactly in the Torah, right? Not exactly where you would expect it, but he was separated from the Leviim. Okay, all the others are verses in the Torah. This is the only one, I guess, because they were stuck and they needed to add an additional one. So they said it must be this. And then they find some verse that at least corresponds with it. Okay, now back to how do we finish this blessing? Michtam, Maichatim. So what's the end of the bracha? Rav Amar Mekadesh Yisrael, as we saw previously. Ushmuel Amar Hamavdil ben Kodesh L'chol. Shmuel says, no, it's our version, even though we didn't see it in the Braita before, right? There's a question, how could he disagree with the Braita, right? It seems a little bit strange, and not only that, but he disagrees with the Braita and we end up holding like him, okay? But that's what he says, and that's what we do. Layit Allah Abaye v'itema Rav Yosef, either Abaye or Rav Yosef. Remember, Rav Yosef was Abaye's rabbi. Remember, Abaye is always reminding Rav Yosef of everything he forgot. So one of them said, Layit means he cursed. Okay, this is very strong language. We'll see in a minute why. He cursed Ahad Rav. Anyone who says like Rav Mekadesh Yisrael should be cursed. So it's a very harsh language, and there's a great footnote in the Koran that talks about this. And it's great because it's a historical answer. And he says basically, you know, he raises the issue. This thing is kind of surprising. And he says, it's quoted in the name of Rabbi Lazar Moshe Horowitz. He says that the issue is that there were heretics in those days who believed in Sunday, right? Christians. They were Christian heretics who believed that Sunday is the holy day. Now, if you say Mekadesh Israel, you're kind of ignoring the Kodesh L'chol. And maybe you're ignoring it. This is kind of like the bracha of the Malshinim and the Minim, and they institute that blessing so that you wouldn't have people getting up to daven who were heretics and they wouldn't say it. You would know right away because they wouldn't say a blessing to curse themselves. So likewise, they're not going to say Havdalah, Hamavdil ben Kodesh L'chol, between the sacred day and the non-sacred day, if they want to keep Sunday as a sacred day. And therefore, they didn't want to say that. And they said the version of Rav. And therefore, now when Rav said it, obviously this wasn't such an issue, right? But as time developed, that language, if you're going to choose that language over the other, it might be that you're doing it because you believe that Sunday is a sanctified day. And therefore, he said anyone who does that is cursed, because he wanted to, make sure those people weren't saying, weren't doing that. It was like kind of against those heretics. Very, very interesting in my mind. Tana Mishmei de Rabbi Yeshua ben Chananya. Now we have a braita in the name, passed down in the name of Rabbi Yeshua ben Chananya. This is very common. We saw this a lot in brachot, that when you have two versions of a blessing, there's a debate which one. One of the approaches is let's combine them. It's nicer to have a combined blessing. Now, by the way, not everyone agrees with this. Some people say you can't end a blessing with two different concepts. Okay, so maybe you'll say this is one concept. It's not two different concepts. Like Rofei Kol Basar Mafli La'asot, the blessing we say Asher Yatzar when we get out of the bathroom. It's also a combination of bracha. Someone says Rofei Kol Basar, someone says Mafli La'asot, and someone said, oh, put them together. Okay. Here, what's interesting is even though it's often nice to put them together, we clearly don't do this because that's not what we say in Havdalah. We say only Hamavdil ben Kodesh L'chol. The Leitel Chata Kavatei, and now you see why we don't hold this way, because if you turn the page, you see the Gemara says we do not hold this way. It's true. I see you're saying Mekadesh Yisrael Vazmanim, right? The Mekadesh Yisrael comes up in Yantif davening, but it doesn't come up in Havdalah. Okay, we don't use that version in Havdalah. Ula Iklela Pupadita. Ula shows up in Pupadita. Now, who is Ula? And I think you need to know this for understanding the story. Ula was one of the first of the people who are called the Nichute, the Yordim, the people who leave Israel and go to Babylonia, but they go back and forth. And Ula seems to have gone back and forth a number of times. And this must be on one of his trips to Babylonia. Why is it interesting? Because when someone comes from afar, you get to learn what they do. And here in particular, people wanted to know, particularly Rav Yehuda wants to know, what does Ula do for Havdalah? Now, if you're Rav Yehuda and you want to know what Ula does for Havdalah, what would you do? You go over to Ula and you'd say, oh, hi, Ula, nice to meet you. I'm Rav Yehuda. I'd like to know what's your Havdalah bracha? But he doesn't do that. He picks a bit of a different approach. Okay, you might not like this approach, but we'll see. Amar le Rav Yehuda le Rav Yitzchak berei. He says to his son Rav Yitzchak, Zil amtele kilkala de peire. Go bring him a basket of fruits. Okay, like kind of disguise yourself as you're just going to bring a nice basket of fruits. V'chaze hechi avdil. Show up there right at Havdalah time and see what he does. Now, what's the connection to the basket of fruits? Either it's just a disguise, okay, just show up there with your basket of fruits. Or some people suggest that maybe he wanted to bring him some food so that when he went to eat the food, he realized I have to make Havdalah, and that would prompt him to make Havdalah while he was there. So maybe that's why. Unclear, but he brings him this, right? He says, bring him a basket of fruits and see what he does. Well, what becomes more interesting about the story is the child's reaction. What does Rav Yitzchak do? Lo azal. He wasn't willing. He didn't like his father's ideas. Okay, this is classic in my house. Okay, my husband's a rabbi and I'm who I am, right? And often my kids get sent to do all sorts of things they don't want to do. In fact, it happened recently. I'll just tell a funny story because we were cracking up about it in my house, that this is totally typical in my house. We were sort of laughing at one of my daughters, but really we were laughing because all my kids said it's something typical. My daughter walked out of the house the other day to go somewhere, and some random person on the street stops her and says, what time is mincha? On the street, there's this mincha minyan on my street. Or Mariv. So she had no idea what time Mariv was. So she leaves a message for Seth, my husband, and she says, some guy on the street, he stopped me and he asked me, what time Marv is, and I don't know, but can you make sure to take care of it? This is not my problem. And it was exactly this, like, this is not you're the rabbi. I don't need to deal with this. Why did this become my problem? So anyway, we had a good laugh about it in the house, because it's usually what happens to children of rabbis. They're stuck doing all sorts of things they don't want to do. So he didn't really want to do this. So anyway, he says, what does he do? So he's not totally irresponsible, just like my daughter. She didn't say, okay, well, listen, I don't know, she said to the person, and moved on. But she was responsible to leave a message for Seth and say, please take care of letting this person know. So likewise, this son of the rabbi says, Shadr Leila Abaye. He sends Abaye instead. He goes and he finds Abaye. Why Abaye? So first of all, Abaye must have been still a kid at the time, right? He wasn't a grown adult in the Abaye that he was, because it wouldn't be appropriate for Rabbi Yitzchak, who we don't even really know so much about, would send Abaye, who's this great gadol. Probably Abaye was still a kid. Now, why was Abaye a good choice? Because Abaye was adopted, if you remember, and he kind of lived on the street. He didn't really have a home. He lived in Rabba's house, but he wasn't Rabba's son, and he probably lived on the street a lot, was around and out and about. And he asked Abaye, will you do it? And Abaye said, sure, no problem. So Abaye goes, right? So it was easier when not the rabbi's son to go do it. So he does it. And in fact, Abaye is sent as a messenger all the time. Okay, Rabba sends him, if you remember from we'll see it when we get to Megillah, but in the Mishlach Manot Sugyo, Rabba sends him to bring Mishlach Manot to him, and then the guy sends him back to bring Mishlach Manot to Rabba, and he's this messenger boy. So he goes, Kiata Abaye Amarle, Hechayama. So he said, so when Abaye gets back to Rav Yitzchak, he reports back to Rav Yitzchak. He doesn't report back to Rav Yehuda, he reports back to Rav Yitzchak. So Rav Yitzchak says, what did he say? Amarle, Baruch HaMavdil ben Kodesh l'chol amal v'tulo. All he said was Baruch Atah Hashem Elokeinu melech haolam havdil b'kodesh l'chol. Period. He didn't say all the stuff before. Forget about, he didn't say 1, he didn't say 3, he didn't say 7, he didn't say anything before. He just said the blessing, right? Which is obviously strange. Ata l'kamei da'avua. So now Rav Yitzchak comes before his father. Amarle hechi amar. So he says, what did he say? Amarle ana lo azle ana shadarti ala Abaye. Now we get the truth, right? He comes out and he says it. He doesn't try to pretend and just pass it on. But he says, listen, I didn't go, but I sent Abaye instead of me. And he told me, right, he wanted to make sure he understands, first of all, it's secondhand, and he was just being honest about it. And he said to me, I'm Avdil ben Kodesh l'chol. By the way, Ula doesn't catch the fact that they were kind of spying on him. There's other stories. I can't remember now where they come up, but I remember other stories where people go to spy on someone and they catch right away what's going on, and they realize, and they kind of get upset about the whole thing. But that didn't happen in this situation. You could even suggest potentially that maybe Rav Yitzchak was being smart about it by sending Abaye, because if the rabbi's son shows up, maybe he's spying. If Abaye, maybe there's less likelihood that he's spying. Possibly. I'm just sort of throwing it out there as a suggestion. But clearly, Ula doesn't pick up on it. So now he says, that's what he said. Amarle. So now what's the father going to respond to the child? He says, listen, Rav Renute Demaru Srarute Demar, the fact that you think you're so great and your arrogance, Garma Le Lamar, the fact that you didn't want to go and you sent someone else instead of you, right? That's showing your srara, your thinking you're better than someone else, like you send your underling to go. He says, Garma Le Lamar Delotema Shmate Mipume. It's gonna cause you problems, because now this whole tradition, we're going to pass it down that Abaye said in the name of Ula, and not that you said it in the name of Ula. Okay, now in their world, this was very important, because this was saying basically, right, that that who passes down the tradition is very critical, and you're basically removing yourself from that, and things won't be said in your name. By the way, I was teaching this just before this class in the Hebrew, and someone at the end of class said something very smart, which is, it's not just in their times, but in our times, right? Bibliography, and you have to quote who your sources are. And it's very, very important that things be said, right? Everyone's very, I'm the one who said this. This is my chidush. So anyway, it's also true nowadays, even. It's the same, at least in certain circles. So now, Gemara is going to bring a question on Ula. Meitive. Wait a minute. Now we're going to learn general rules about brachot. And we're going to see that Havdalah doesn't fall into this exceptional category, in which case, it should not be just a bracha, okay? And how could Ula have done that? So meitive, we're going to learn about different brachot. Kol brachot kulan poteach bebaruch v'chotem behem bebaruch. All blessings, okay, all except for all the exceptions we're going to see, theoretically start with a baruch and end with a baruch. So now they start with baruch. Oh, yeah, this is very good. I'm sorry. As I'm teaching, I'm also reading the chat. I see Ruth wrote me an excellent point, which is the fact that we don't hear so much about Rav Yitzchak might be because of this, right? That this story is kind of telling us why the son of Rav Yehuda, who's such a great gadol, right? His son doesn't end up, having his name be known. Maybe this is the reason. Anyway, yafeh. Good point. Okay, so now let's go back to our kol habrachot kulam potech bebaruch v'chotem behem bebaruch. Chutz mi berkat mitzvot uberkat haperot uberchas muchal lechaverta ubracha achrona shebekriyat shema. You see there's a long list of exceptions, but okay, so let's go through. All brachot start with Baruch and end with Baruch. Okay, like for example, Brachot Torah, we start saying Baruch Hashem Elokeinu melech haolam, right, and then we go on, right, and then we say Baruch Hashem Elokeinu Torah L'Amo Yisrael. So we basically start with Baruch, end with Baruch. Then we have the net, right? Then we end up with blessings. So here are the exceptions to the rule. Berkat mitzvah, berkat perot, just have Baruch Hashem Elokeinu melech haolam. Simply. Now this is already our problem because Havdalah is not a Birchot mitzvah, and it's not a Birchot perot. Okay, the question is, what is it exactly? And that's a bit of a question. But it doesn't seem like it's one of these two. And these are the only two that just have a bracha. So when you're about to eat food, you just make one bracha. When you're about to do a mitzvah, you just make one bracha. But Havdalah, they don't count really as a mitzvah. Okay, and it's not in that category. What else do we have? So we have bracha smucha lechaverta. Okay, that's like Kriyat Shema. We start with Baruch Atah Hashem Elokeinu melech haolam yotzer or vorei choshech. Then we end with Yotzer HaMe'orot, Baruch Atah Hashem Yotzer HaMe'orot, that Potech Baruch ends with Baruch. Then we immediately start another bracha. Now notice, it doesn't start with Baruch because it's what we call Smucha L'Chaverta, or in benching. We have Nodeh, right? Nodeh L'cha is right after a bracha, so you don't need it to start with Baruch. It just ends with Baruch, but you have a whole paragraph before, right? So those are brachas Smucha L'Chaverta. They also don't need to start with the Baruch. After Kriyat Shema, we say Amet v'yatziv or Amet v'emunah. That also doesn't. That's because we view it as connected. It's really smucha l'chaverta, even though Kriyat Shema breaks it up in the middle. And then it says sheyesh mehem poteach behem bebaruch ve'en chotein bebaruch. There's also ones that start with Baruch and don't end with Baruch, meaning you start with a Baruch and then there's a long blessing and it never ends with Baruch. We'll see which one in 1 minute. Ve'yesh mehen shechotein bebaruch ve'en poteach bebaruch. And there's some that end with Baruch but don't start with Baruch. So atov v'metiv, that's the one which is the bracha in benching. Poteach bebaruch ve'eno chotein bebaruch. We have this very weird bracha. It always seems weird. We start with Baruch Atah Hashem after Uvenei Yerushalayim, right? We start it's hatov v'metiv yalanu gumalanu gomlenu, that whole blessing. Notice it starts with Baruch and it doesn't end with a Baruch, right? It's always weird when the person who's mizamein ends, right? The person who does the zimun ends with without saying Baruch Atah Hashem. It's like missing something. So that is an exception to the rule, and the reason for that is because we learned this in brachot. Since the first 3 blessings are by Torah law, and the 4th blessing was instituted after the destruction of Beital. So they added it after for all these people who had died. So then they basically said, it was, I think the martyrs, I forget exactly now. It's not in my head. My head's on the daf. But anyway, that whole story there of the Harugei Beital. So they now say it's that bracha has to stand by itself and start with a Baruch, even though it really is Smucha L'Chaverta, and theoretically it didn't, but because of that they added. So that's an exception to the rule. But now they say, oh, right. Thank you for reminding me, Gita. It was that there were these martyrs, they were killed, and then their bodies didn't decompose, even though they wouldn't let them be buried for a really long time. Thanks for refreshing my memory. Okay, so that was the miracle of that, and because of that, they said Atov Amitiv. So now, this is Kasha Le'ula, because Havdalah doesn't fall into any of these exceptions. So why doesn't it start with a Baruch and end with a Baruch? Why did Ula do it in that way? So Amar L'cha Ula could answer, Hanami ke Birkat HaMitzvah Damya. Really, it's like a Birkat HaMitzvah. Birkat HaMitzvah, my time. Why is it like a Birkat HaMitzvah? What's the purpose of a Birkat HaMitzvah? Mishum de hoda'ahi. It's a way of thanking God. Hanami hoda'ahi. We're really thanking God for giving us Shabbat and giving us this day that's distinguished from, right? And separating us from all the other nations and separating all the separations that God did. They were helpful. It's like a Birkat HaHoda'ah. Therefore, it's like a Birkat HaMitzvah. And that's why he didn't start it with a Baruch or end it with a Baruch. It just had a simple Baruch Atah Hashem Elokeinu melech haolam mavdil b'kodesh chol. Obviously, we don't do this, right? We have it start with a Baruch and end with a Baruch. But he did it that way, and it's okay because he categorized it that way. And here you see the categorization of this blessing is a little bit tricky. Okay, with that, we'll finish for today. Tomorrow, we're going to go back. Okay, there's a bit of a strange order going on here, right? We started with Pesach. We got right away off of the topic of Pesach. We got into Kiddush and stopping your meal and things like that. We're going to get back now. Then we got off on a tangent about Havdalah. Now we're getting back to stopping your meal. Okay, later we're going to get back to Havdalah. So it's a whole back and forth here in all these dapim. And with that, we'll stop here for today. And tomorrow's shiur will be up in a little while. Okay, have a Shabbat Shalom, everyone.